So welcome to the video on price controls and surplus. Now things are going to get interesting. Now we have the basis of understanding what buyers' incentives are, what sellers' incentives are, what we can expect when things happen, and now we can start to talk about, well, are markets efficient? Are they not efficient? Could we do things in a better way? What is the impact of if we try and intervene and try and make things better? We're going to start off with the most fundamental, foundational idea of understanding if things are good or bad, and it's called a surplus. So let's jump right in. Let's start off with understanding the demand side. It's the amount you're willing and able to purchase at a range of prices at a given time. What we're really saying there is it's the buyer's value. You're not going to be willing to pay more than what you value something. So for a second, think about the demand curve as representing buyer's value. If the price of a good is more than what you value it, you're not willing to buy. If the price of good is at or below your value, you're willing to buy. So let's say I'm really hungry and I'm willing to pay $10 for a pizza, Little Caesars pizza. But Little Caesars doesn't charge me $10 for pizza. They only charge me $6 for a pizza. Well, the difference between what I was willing to pay and what I had to pay is extra value I gained from that transaction. And what we're going to see is that concept of the difference between what people were willing to pay and what they had to pay for every person in that market. If we add that up, we can get an idea of how much added value the buyers are getting from market transactions. So let's start off and draw a market equilibrium. So we have a supply, a demand, an equilibrium price, and an equilibrium quantity. Remember that the price in the market is the price that everyone has to pay to get that good. There are some people who would spend $100 on a pizza. They love it, but they don't have to because the market price is set for everyone. We're going to tinker with some of these assumptions later on in the semester, but for now, P star is the market price. If we look at my example before where I said I was willing to pay $10, but only had to pay the market price of $6. We can identify that extra $4 is surplus. But we could identify that surplus for buyers with high values, buyers with medium values, and buyers with low values. And what we're going to end up with is this triangle here that shows the difference between what the buyers were willing and able to pay and what they actually had to pay. And we're going to call that consumer surplus. Well, just like buyers can get extra value from being in a transaction, producers can get extra value from being in the transaction. Maybe Little Caesars sold that pizza for $6, but maybe they were willing and able to sell it for less. Maybe they were willing to sell it for $3. So they were willing to sell it for $3. They got $6. They got an extra $3 of value. Just like we talked about the demand curve being the buyer's value, we could talk about the supply curve being the seller's value. And what we want to think about is what is the extra value they're getting from participating in the market? Producer surplus, just like we discussed before, is the difference between how much a seller was willing to sell a product for and what they actually received. Maybe I was willing to have a job and willing to sell my labor for $10 an hour, but I actually got $15. That difference between what I was willing to sell my labor for and what I received is producer surplus. So let's draw it. Again, we're going to have a baseline market, which has a supply and demand curve. We're going to have an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. We can look at the supply curve as being the seller's value. So that's what the seller was willing and able to sell a product for. And the price is what they actually received. So maybe I was willing to sell my labor for $10 an hour, but I got $15. There are other people who are going to get more value from that than me. So maybe there was someone who was willing to have a job at $5 an hour, but now they are getting $15. So they're getting $10 of consumer surplus. Maybe there was someone who would have only entered the market at $14 and they're now getting $15. So they're getting $1 of surplus. They're not getting as much surplus as I am. That's okay. So again, the triangle between what the sellers are willing to sell and what they received is going to be called producer surplus. The notation is going to be P. From a societal planning point of view, we're going to start to make some changes, and we want to say, are these things good or are they bad for society? Now, we could look at this from a couple different perspectives, and we will. We'll want to say, okay, if we make this change, is it good for the buyers? Is it good for the sellers? And then what we need is it good for the economy as a whole? We're going to say that there are only 3 players in the market. There are buyers, there are sellers, and there's the government. And we're going to be talking about the government later on when we add taxes, but for now, we're going to exclude the government. The total surplus has to come from either the consumers or the producers. When we draw it, again, we have a equilibrium, supply and demand curve, and an equilibrium. We have an area of consumer surplus, and we have an area of producer surplus. And now what we're going to just do is say total surplus is the sum of those 2 areas. So it just becomes the bigger triangle. So now that we have consumer surplus and producer surplus and total surplus, we can start to to analyze some really cool societal problems and societal issues. So one that you're probably familiar with is the minimum wage. In general, what we call the minimum wage in economics is a price floor. I want to be really clear. Price controls, and there'll be two of them, price floors and price ceilings, are often done with really good intentions. People want to make things better. Now what we could do is we could start to analyze what the impact is of a price floor. When you think of the floor, think of what's beneath you. You can't go beneath the floor. So a price floor is the lowest legal level beneath which the government does not allow trades. Let's graph this and analyze what's happening to consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw a supply and demand curve. And what we're going to then do is have the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. Let's talk about minimum wage for a second. So the market here would be the labor market. And maybe in Invergrove, the equilibrium price for low or unskilled labor, maybe it's $10. But the government of Invergrove Heights may decide that they want to have a price floor, minimum wage, of $15. In other words, we don't want anyone to be able to earn less than $15 an hour. So we're going to draw in that price floor. Notice as the price floor is above the equilibrium, what would we have said just a couple chapters ago? We would analyze what quantity supply is, the quantity supplied of labor, and we'd have the quantity demanded of labor. Here we have the quantity supplied is bigger than the quantity demanded. Okay, so we have a surplus of labor. What would normally happen? If you were in that surplus and saying, hey, I want a job, people are getting paid $15 an hour, and I don't have one, what would I like to do? I would like to say, don't hire that person for $15, hire me, I'm willing to work for $14. And there would normally be a downward pressure on the price. But at this point, the government doesn't allow there to be a downward pressure. So we're stuck. The equilibrium and the market isn't allowed to interact, and we have this surplus. Now what I want to do is I want to look at and show what was consumer surplus and producer surplus when we were at the market equilibrium. Well, the consumer surplus was the difference between what people were willing to pay for labor. The demand side is the firms in this case, they're the hirers of labor, and what they actually had to pay. It's that top triangle, is consumer surplus. Then we could look at the suppliers of labor. In this case, it's the workers. And the supply curve says what they were willing and able to sell their labor at, and P star is what they actually received. Now the price floor goes into effect. Notice what happens on the quantity demanded. As the price floor goes up, what happened to quantity demanded? That's right. Quantity demanded goes down. Your intuition should say that makes sense. As the price of labor and the price of workers go up, firms are going to hire less workers. My only assumption here is the law of demand. What about what's happening on the quantity supplied side? As the wages go up, the price of labor goes up, quantity supplied increases. We're attracting more people into the labor market. So when we look at the number of people who are unemployed, we can decompose the composite number into two parts. We can decompose it into the new workers who we attracted into the job market who now don't have a job, and we can find the subset of those people who had a job, but now at the higher wage rate, firms aren't willing to hire them. So we could talk about new unemployment and old unemployment. So we could break that down. But also, let's think about what's happening here to consumer surplus. So consumer surplus was the big triangle, and as the prices went up, it became smaller and smaller. The consumers of labor, that size definitely got smaller. That makes sense, right? Firms, all else equal, would rather have cheap labor than more expensive labor. Okay, that makes sense. What about producers of labor, the workers? Do they like higher wages? Well, there are two parts. The first part is those who are in between 0 and QD, those who still have jobs. If you still have a job and you used to get paid $10 an hour and now you're getting paid $15 an hour, guess what? You're really happy. However, if you're between QD and Q star, in other words, you had a job at $10 an hour, you were willing and able to accept that job at $10 an hour, and now no one's willing to hire you, you've lost that part of consumer surplus. Okay, so we have consumer surplus being this triangle. We have producer surplus being this trapezoid. What happened to this other triangle? What happened to the number of trades that happened between QD and Q star? You're right. Those trades are not taking place right now. So how much benefit are you getting from the trades that you're not participating in? 0. We call that loss of surplus to be dead weight loss. DWL. And because total surplus went down, we can now say that price floors are probably a bad thing to society. Now, I'm not saying that we should pay workers less. That's not what I'm saying at all. As a matter of fact, I think there are other solutions that I think are going to be very valuable to help increase productivity and increase the wages for workers. But price floors and minimum wages often have a negative impact that is often not the intended consequence. I want to highlight an idea called binding or non-binding. Let's get back to our wage rate. If Inver Grove Heights had a free market and the wage for unskilled or low-skilled labor was about $10, the price floor at $15 blocks anything from below $15. It blocks us from getting to that attractive competitive equilibrium. The equilibrium and the market wants to get to $10, but there's something preventing it. Let's say, for example, that the city government was feeling pressured, and even though the wage rate was $10, they passed a law saying you can't pay anyone less than $5 an hour. The price floor was below the equilibrium wage. But what would happen? If I had hired you at $10 an hour, we'd look at each other and say, there's nothing going on here. I'm already meeting that requirement, and we're done. Now, for some reason, students think that if the government passes a minimum wage that's below the equilibrium, that suddenly the entire economy is going to reset. So let's pretend for a second that we draw in a price floor at $5. And what we're going to see is the quantity demanded is bigger than the quantity supplied at $5. There will be a market pressure up because there is a shortage of labor at $5. Can the price go above $5? Yes. The government just said it can't go below $5. So competition will bring us right back to the equilibrium. If the price floor is below the equilibrium, we call it non-binding. In other words, it has no impact whatsoever. But if the price floor is above the equilibrium, it prevents us from getting to the equilibrium. You can't go beneath the floor, and we call that binding. Next, I want to go over what is one of the ugliest graphs of the semester. But once you see it, it'll make sense. So we're going to have three graphs. On the left is going to be a market where the government is not involved. It's a free market where the supply and demand are allowed to get to equilibrium, and we'd have an area for consumer surplus and an area for producer surplus. Next, we're going to have the price-controlled market. And the price-controlled market, in this case, we're talking about price floors. And we're going to talk about it being a binding price floor. When it's a binding price floor, the price floor is above the equilibrium wage, and consumer surplus is the top triangle, and producer surplus is this trapezoid type thing, and there's a deadweight loss. Now, what the book has is it has these two graphs superimposed on top of each other. When it has these two graphs superimposed on top of each other, it then numbers each of these areas. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What that allows us to do is to do some comparisons. It allows us to analyze what happened to consumer surplus, producer surplus, total surplus, and deadweight loss in each of these market structures using the numbers. So now that we have these numbers, what I want us to do is I want us to identify in the free market where we'd find consumer surplus using the numbers. Did you get it? So what we're looking for is where is consumer surplus in the free market using the numbers on the right? It would be 1, 2, and 3. Then I want to find where producer surplus is in the free market using those numbers. So the producer surplus is this bottom triangle, which if we then go over and look at the numbers, it's 4 and 5. So total surplus is the big triangle. It's consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Well, that's got to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now we're going to move over to the price control or the price floor. So the price controlled market, we're going to look at consumer surplus using the numbers. That's just 1. Where's the producer surplus using these numbers? That's 2 and 4. So total surplus is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. That's 1, 2, and 4. Now let's skip deadweight loss for a split second, and let's talk about the change. Consumer surplus. It used to be 1, 2, and 3, and now it's just 1. Well, we lost 2 and 3. So consumer surplus went down. Well, we knew that. Minimum wage was never trying to help the consumers of labor. It was never trying to help the firms. It was trying to help the workers. We know it's bad for the consumers of labor. That went down. Producer surplus. It went from 4 and 5 to 2 and 4. So we gained 2 and we lost 5. How do we interpret that? If you are in the first group where you had a job and you still have a job and you're getting paid more, you're gaining the area of surplus of 2. You are better off. You have a job and you're getting paid more. You like this policy. But then we have the loss of 5. Well, what is that? If we have less people getting hired, these were people who had a job who don't have a job anymore. So think of yourself as a biased news reporter. If you think the minimum wage is a good thing, you are only going to interview the people who still have a job and get paid more. If you're a biased news reporter and you are against minimum wage, you're only going to hire those people who lost their job. An unbiased news reporter would have to estimate the size of the square, 2, which is base times height, and estimate the size of the triangle in 5, and identify and say there's some people who are helped, and we think it helped them by X amount, and there's some people who are hurt. So now you could do a comparison and say, overall, we think it helped or hurt. It's not clear until we actually have numbers in there, whether it improved or got smaller. Total surplus went from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to just 1, 2, and 4. We lost 3 and we lost 5. That's why we're calling it a deadweight loss. The deadweight loss is the decrease in total surplus. So now we can put the deadweight loss in. So think about this for a second. If you wanted to minimize the deadweight loss, what would you do? If you push the price floor down, as you push the price floor down, notice the deadweight loss is going to get smaller. If you push the price ceiling up more, you are going to distort the economy even more, and the deadweight loss is going to get larger. So we talked about price floors, now we're going to talk about price ceilings. This is the other price control. This one, when you think of ceiling, you think of above, but what the idea here is that the price, for some reason, is perceived to be too high. So when it's perceived to be too high, government can walk in and say, you know what, let's not allow it to get above a certain level. So let's think about Manhattan, New York for a second, and I'm going to make up numbers here. So let's pretend a studio apartment rents for $3,000 a month, and people on city council just say, that's too expensive. People and family can't survive if they're spending $3,000 a month on rent. So we're going to force that price down. Again, we would have binding and non-binding. I'm talking about a binding price ceiling. We want to talk about the impact that would have. And as you might guess, it's going to look remarkably similar to price floors. We're going to draw a supply and demand curve, and we're going to talk about housing. We're going to have a equilibrium price and quantity, and this is what would be happening in Manhattan or any area if the market was allowed to work. A price ceiling comes in. The price ceiling is going to be binding. It's going to force the price down. Notice what's happening to quantity demanded and quantity supplied. Let's look at quantity demanded first. So bring the price over and watch what happens on the demand. As the price goes down, more and more people actually are incentivized to move into Manhattan and say, you know what, I didn't want my own studio. I was willing to be a roommate with someone at $3,000, but at $200, I want my own place. Quantity demanded increased. Now let's look at what happened on quantity supplied. We're trying to understand the incentive for people to create housing. As the housing prices went from $5,000 and gets pushed down, and I'm just making it more dramatic, as it gets pushed down, the incentive for those to produce those houses have gone down. Quantity supplied has decreased. We now have quantity demanded bigger than quantity supplied. That difference between quantity demanded and quantity supplied is a housing shortage. How would we normally handle this? Well, normally what we would do is those people who are in the shortage, who aren't getting the home, would say, don't rent to that person, rent to me, I'll pay you more. And the price would start to increase. As the price starts to increase, we would have some more quantity supplied enter the market because they now have a greater incentive to produce, and some quantity demanded would drop out of the market. Why? Because they're willing to be roommates, or they'd live in a lower cost city, or they would do something else. Normally, the price would go up and the shortage would go away. But now, with this price ceiling, we're not allowed to do that. Just like we did before, we have a shortage of housing. We can decompose that number of how many houses we're short or housing we're short based on those who had housing and lost housing, and those who didn't have housing who've now entered the market and can't get housing. That shortage can help us understand what's going on. Now we're going to see that there's a couple impacts. First is on the demand side. Before, you used to pay, if you were in the first group between 0 and QS, and you used to pay $3,000 a month for housing, and now you get it for $200 a month. If you're in that first group, you think this is great because you're getting your apartment cheaper. However, if you're in the second group between the quantity supplied, where there's the ceiling, and Q star, you had housing and you lost it. All that surplus is now gone. We could also talk about producer surplus. Producer surplus was this bottom triangle, and now it's this smaller triangle. It went down. It clearly went. That makes sense. Why did it go down for the landlord? Well, you're getting hit by two impacts. The first is you're losing this triangle here, because the number of people you're renting to went down. Then the next impact is you're losing the square, because for every person you are renting to still, you're getting less money. So we know producer surplus went down. How many trades actually happened in this market? QD is the number of people who want apartments, but QS is the number of apartments that are available. It takes 2 to tango. It takes 2 to make a trade. So only QS trades happen. So what happened to the surplus that was happening between QS and Q star? Well, you're right. That's deadweight loss again. And again, the more you distort the market, the more you push the price further away from the equilibrium, the greater that deadweight loss is going to be.